In this video, I'm going to cover how to separate things out for compositing. It's pretty straightforward. There's only one essential piece of information that you really need to know, and that is that any elements that are rendered out as separate passes need to be rendered against a black background. That is so that you avoid any fringing problems when you composite things back together in Nuke or Photoshop or After Effects or whatever you want to use. So although you might think that just isolating something with an alpha channel is enough, it isn't enough because any anti-aliasing along the edge of your element, if there's any color or lighting information in the background, is basically going to cause fringing, which is why you need to render against a black background. So I'll just quickly talk you through how to set this up. So let's say I want to isolate the character from the rest of the background in this shot here. What I need to do is to use an override shader in the shader tree. So let's just close this up. So I've got my character shading here, and then just below it I've got an override which is overriding everything else below it in the shader tree, which is basically to say the entire environment. And I just make sure that that's invisible to camera. I obviously still need the environment to be visible to reflections, to GI, to cast and receive shadows. All that stuff needs to be kept on so that your character has the correct appearance if any shadows are cast upon him. If he's reflecting the environment, obviously all the shadows need to be part of that. So it's just visibility to camera that needs to be turned off. And let me just refresh preview so we can see what happens here. Now this is still incorrect because now he's rendering against a white background, and that's definitely going to cause me a white fringe in comp, and I don't want that. So there's two ways of avoiding the white background. One is I could simply turn my environment's visibility to camera off. The other thing you can do is to drag your render outputs into an item masked group here in the shader tree. So that's how I've set up this character pass. I've got everything inside this folder, which is basically item masked to just this one character, and I've got a shader in there and all my render outputs. Now if I unpause now, we should hopefully see that automatically places the character inside a black background. But alternatively, you can also just use the visible to camera, or indeed use both. There's no reason not to be safe. So that's the crucial piece of information. Always remember to render any separate elements out against a black background. And additionally, it's also considered good practice to unpre-multiply your render outputs. So what this means is that you should select all your render outputs that are destined for compositing. So that's your final color output, all your shading outputs, and your lighting outputs. And this checkbox here, unpre-multiply colors, should be enabled. So what this is going to do is that it's not going to multiply your alpha channel by your final color. So that sounds very confusing, but I'll show you exactly what this means in Nuke. So this render output that we're looking at here has nice smooth edges, and this means that the edges have been pre-multiplied with the alpha. Basically, the anti-aliasing from the alpha channel has been applied to the final color output, and they've been blended together so that we get these nice smooth edges. But the potential problem with this is by adding the alpha channel information, by essentially baking it into the actual RGB output, we could find ourselves in situations where we have problems with fringing. So instead, we use unpre-multiply, which essentially means we're not pre-multiplying the alpha. And I'll show you what that looks like if I switch to this other render output. Here you can see we've got visibly jagged edges because the alpha channel is not pre-multiplied into the RGB. Now if I switch to the actual alpha channel itself, you can see it's still nice and smooth, and in fact if I switch between the two rendered outputs, there's no difference at all in the alpha channel. But if I switch between the RGB channels, you can see there is indeed a visible difference, because in this case the alpha channel information has been multiplied into the RGB output, and in this case it hasn't, which is why we have this jagged edge. So just to recap, basically if you tick unpre-multiply colors, you are disabling the pre-multiplication of your alpha channel with your RGB information. And this means that in compositing, although you get this ugly jagged edge, you also have the maximum amount of flexibility, because it means that you can apply the pre-mult operation at any point in your comp. You control when it's applied. So this means that you can do heavier color corrections and are less likely to encounter fringing problems. So the obvious problem is, how do you then composite this output back into your shot when it's got this jagged edge? Well, remember that the alpha channel is still absolutely fine. So if I hit A, you can see the alpha channel is still smooth. So the problem is actually very easy to fix, and I'll demonstrate this right now. So I'll just quickly merge my background nodes together. Let me just point my viewer to this merge operation I'm making, and let's Shift X these so that the table shows up, and you can see that the table also has this jagged edge because I've rendered the table with unpremultiply on. So that means that its alpha channel is not being multiplied by its RGB channel. And now I'll add another merge node here, and let's just connect it to this output here. And once again, I need to Shift X. So you can see obviously that the version of the output that has been pre-multiplied is really easy to composite in because it comes in already anti-aliased. But if I now point my merge node here, the jagged edge is visible. But it's really, really simple to fix. All you need to do is to add a pre-mult node. So what I'm going to do is hit Tab, and then I'm going to hit pre-mult and just add a pre-mult node. And as soon as I do that, you can see that my jagged edge has disappeared. And if I was to disable the pre-mult node, it returns. So I need to do the same thing with the table. So once again, I'll just hit Tab and hit return my pre-mult node. And again, once I add the pre-mult node, the jagged edge disappears. But as I said earlier, this means that we have a lot of flexibility because I can add this pre-mult at any point in the comp. So I don't have to add it straight away. I can add it later on. It just means that between this connection and this connection, I can do some heavy grading, and I'll get good edges whatever I do because I'm doing the pre-multiplication at the point of my own choosing. Another compositing consideration is, how do you rebuild your final color output from individual render outputs, and which render outputs should you use? Well, the answer is very simple. You should use your shading render output. So by this I mean, if I select a render output and go to the effect column and then go to the shading submenu here, all of these render outputs, bar the shaded AA samples, which is more of a diagnostic tool, but all of the others are the ones that you should use to rebuild your final color. And you should do this using an add operation. So Adobe calls it linear dodge, and in Nuke it's called plus. And generally, it's best to avoid using multiply operations to rebuild render outputs, because these are likely to result in fringing problems. And similarly, you should also avoid trying to rebuild your final color output using lighting on top of material outputs, because once again, these are likely to cause fringing problems. So I'm going to switch to Nuke, and I've rendered out the shot with a final color output here and a bunch of render outputs and my environment background on the left hand side. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to add a pre-mult to the first of these render outputs, and then I'm going to add a merge node, and I'm going to set the operation to plus. And I'm going to merge it with the render output underneath. So the first one at the top is the direct shaded render output, and the next one below it is the indirect shaded output. So I'm going to point my viewer to the composite of these two outputs just to see what the final result looks like. And I'm just going to zoom in to make sure that yeah, the B is coming here. It doesn't really matter on the first one, but then I'm going to select these two, and I'm going to hit Alt-C on my keyboard to copy them. And oh yes, I need to copy this pre-mult as well and slot one in there. We need a pre-mult everywhere. And then I'm going to connect this up to the next render output, and then connect the B channel to the node above it. And now I'm just going to carry on going down the chain just copying these and then connecting them up. I'll just pause the video while I finish this off. So I've connected all my shaded outputs together and pointed my viewer to the end of the chain, and if I compare this with the final color output, you can see that except for the environment background, everything is exactly the same. So now it's simply a case of adding this environment output to the rest of the chain. So I'm going to select my environment output and hit M to add a merge node, and this time I can leave the operation as an over one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this connection, the very first one in the shaded outputs, and connect it to the over node, and then I need to take this connection and connect it up. Now I also need to make sure that's B running down the spine. I can see that I need to shift these two around, so let's do that. And having done that, if I now compare the end of this chain, which is on viewer number 2, to the final color output, there should be no difference. So this is the end of the chain, this is the composite, and this is the final color output, and you can see there's absolutely no difference between the two at all. So just to give you a final recap, the very first node in the chain is the environment, and that is merged with the first node from the shaded outputs in a simple over operation. And then we're connecting that with a bunch of merge nodes using a plus operation just to add all the various shaded outputs one on top of the other. So if we go through them one by one, we can see what we've got. So we started with the environment, and then we've got the direct shaded output. Next it's the indirect shaded output, followed by the luminous shading output, followed by the reflection shading output, and then we've got the specular shading output, the subsurface shading output, finally the transparent shading output, which in this scene is empty, it's completely black. And these all add up to give us this composite, which is basically the exact same thing as the final color output.